Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you're listening from. Welcome to this final election rally of the Socialist Equality Party, where you will hear our candidates, Kishore and Norissa Santa Cruz, and other speakers from the Socialist Equality Party and the International Committee of the Fourth International. My name is David North. I'm the national chairperson of the Socialist Equality Party and the international editor of the World Socialist Web Site. Let me begin by pointing out that the presidential election of 2020 is being held in the midst of a global crisis triggered by a pandemic that can be compared only to the outbreak of World War I in 1914 and World War II in 1939. As we meet, the worldwide death toll has reached, according to available official statistics, 1,196,000. The largest number of deaths is in the United States, where as of yesterday, 236,072 lives have been lost. In Brazil, 159,884 people have died. The death toll in India is 122,111. In Mexico, 91,743. In Britain, 46,791. In Italy, 38,618. In France, 36,826. And in Germany, 10,494. These official figures certainly understate the total number of deaths. The COVID-19 virus is now spreading uncontrollably. During the past 2 weeks, deaths have increased over the previous 2-week period by 24.5% in France, in Spain, 129% in Poland, 135% in Britain, 200% in France, 323% in Italy, and 2,286% in Germany. In the United States, where the spread of the virus has never been brought under control, the pandemic is surging in virtually every state. The interaction of the Trump administration's deliberate efforts to spread the virus, the broader policy of reopening the schools, forcing workers to stay on the job despite unsafe conditions, the prioritizing of profit over lives, and the staggering decline in the cultural level of the population produced by 40 years of reactionary social policy have resulted in the ongoing catastrophe. Whatever the outcome of the election on Tuesday, the death toll will continue to rise at a horrifying rate in the weeks and months ahead. In his most recent statement, Anthony Fauci bluntly said that the United States is hurtling toward disaster. And I quote, "We're in for a whole lot of hurt. It's not a good situation. All the stars are aligned in the wrong place as you go into the fall and winter season, with people congregating at home and indoors. You could not possibly be positioned more poorly." If anything has become clear during the last 8 to 9 months, it is that it is entirely inadequate to conceive of the pandemic in purely medical terms. It is, above all, a political crisis. Of course, there is a virus which is killing people. But the response to the pandemic, the failure, or more accurate, the refusal to implement policies that would save lives, has been determined by the financial interests of the capitalist class. Any discussion of policies required to fight the virus that exclude an examination of the socioeconomic interests that blocked an effective response to the pandemic is worthless. Moreover, the failure to contain the pandemic is not merely the product of the bad policies of a few ignorant or even criminal political leaders. The fact that the pandemic is raging across the globe, that the death toll is rising rapidly in the advanced capitalist countries of Western Europe, and that the greatest number of deaths is being recorded in the richest and most powerful capitalist imperialist country, the United States, indicts the entire world capitalist system. The claims that the impact of the pandemic could not be foreseen are transparent lies. Scientists have been issuing detailed warnings for years. But like every other major social and societal problem, the response of governments has been determined by the financial interests of the ruling elites. A great historical crisis, and the pandemic is of that magnitude, reveals and puts to the test the perspective and programs of all parties. The toll in human lives that I have already cited constitutes a devastating exposure of the programs and policies of all capitalist governments and ruling class parties. But as this is the last public event of the Socialist Equality Party's election campaign, it is a fitting time to review the response of our party to this historic crisis. How has the SEP measured up? The first public event of the SEP's presidential election campaign was held in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on February 24th, just over 8 months ago. On that date, the total global death toll was 2,699. There were, on that date, no recorded deaths in the United States. But the Socialist Equality Party was already warning of the danger posed by the pandemic. In introducing Comrade Joseph Kishore as the presidential candidate of the SEP and speaking on behalf of the party, I stated, national problems are in essence world problems, requiring coordinated global solutions. The imperialist powers are engaged in a frenzied military buildup in pursuit of their criminal objectives. China and Russia are also building up their military forces. And I continued. But as the national states prepare to fight over markets and pieces of territory, the coronavirus takes no notice of borders and spreads across the globe. The virus, traveling without a passport and without bothering to apply for a visa, is utterly indifferent to the nationality, ethnicity, racial background, or religion of its potential victims. End of quote. On March 6th, the Socialist Equality Party issued a statement, "What must be done to fight the coronavirus pandemic?" On the date in which that statement was issued, the total number of COVID-19 deaths worldwide was just 3,493. In the United States, there were only 15 recorded deaths. The WSWS stated, and again I quote, "The coronavirus pandemic continues to spread through dozens of countries around the world in what is among the worst outbreaks of infectious disease in a century, threatening the lives of millions of people. Refuting the White House's criminally dishonest dismissal of the disease's severity, the number of cases in the United States continues to rise rapidly. The response at every level of government has been negligent and incompetent, exposing a total lack of planning and preparation in the world's richest capitalist country. The indifference of the Trump administration to the health and the population is not better and perhaps worse than the attitude of the pharaohs to the ancient Egyptians, of ancient Egypt to their slaves. The media has spent more time bemoaning the fall in share values than the loss of human life. This social catastrophe must be prevented. All sections of the working class, youth, and students must demand that governments take emergency actions to stop the spread of the virus and provide the necessary care for all those who are infected by the disease. This requires a massive reallocation of social resources. The principle that must guide the response is that the needs of society overrule the interests of profit. Capitalist calculations of share values and profits must not be allowed to limit, undermine, or prevent the combating of the disease." End of quote. On March 13th, the worldwide COVID-19 death toll stood at 5,493. In the US, 48 deaths have been reported. The WSWS posted an article titled, "Capitalism is at war with society," and it stated, I quote again, The outbreak of the pandemic and its consequences can only be understood within the context of the development of global capitalism over the past 4 decades. These 4 decades have revealed all the socially reactionary characteristics of a system based on private ownership of the means of production, in which all considerations of social need are subordinated to the drive for profit and vast personal wealth. The motto of the capitalist oligarchy is, if the accumulation of our billions requires the death of millions, so be it. Unquote. Prophetic words. On March 17th, the worldwide COVID-19 death toll had risen to 8,046. In the United States, 121 people had died. The National Committee of the Socialist Equality Party issued a program of action for the working class. This statement provided a detailed analysis of the global refusal of capitalist governments to take the actions necessary to stop the rapid spread of the virus. The National Committee declared, and I quote, "To the extent that private property gets in the way of emergency measures, it must be swept aside. All industries that are being bailed out by the government must instead be converted into public utilities under the democratic control of the working class, redirected toward the production of critical necessities. If a war had broken out, economic life would be restructured by the ruling elites to produce the instruments of death. Now it is a matter of producing the instruments of life. Two irreconcilable interests of two classes stand opposed to each other. For the capitalists, it is a question of securing their profit interests and ensuring that their property and wealth remain untouched. No measures are to be taken that impinge on their interests. The working class is concerned with the interests of the broad mass of humanity, proceeding not from private profit, but from social need. We raise these demands in order to mobilize workers, raise their class consciousness, develop their understanding of the need for international class solidarity, and increase their political self-confidence. We place no confidence in any capitalist government to combat the pandemic, and we fully expect them to resist these demands. What can or cannot be achieved will be determined in struggle." End of quote. During the final week of March, the US Congress voted virtually unanimously to pour trillions of dollars into Wall Street and raise plunging share values in a rescue operation that vastly exceeded the bailout of 2008-2009. Once the provisions of the bailout had been agreed upon and the CARES Act passed, the government and the two capitalist parties abandoned efforts to stop the spread of the virus. The policy of herd immunity, encouraging the infection of large sections of the population, went into effect. The signal for this homicidal course was provided by the lead columnist of the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, who enthusiastically touted the inhuman policies instituted by the Swedish government. Now, since the end of March, 230,000 American lives have been lost to COVID-19. The total global loss of life since the end of March is over 1 million. Throughout the election campaign, the policies of the Socialist Equality Party have been based on a Marxist analysis of the global capitalist crisis, the conflicting interests of the major social classes, and the logic of the international crisis. Our election program has been consistent with the principles that guide the fight for the political independence of the working class, the struggle for workers' power, and the building of a socialist society in the United States and internationally. The SEP does not have a special program for elections determined by short-term, pragmatic, and wildly impressionist calculations of so-called electoral reality. The SEP remains a revolutionary socialist party in an election year. This essential point must be emphasized when it is being proclaimed from all sides that Trump and Biden are engaged in a titanic existential conflict in which the forces of good and evil stand starkly opposed. Never before has the conflict between two factions of the American oligarchy been portrayed in such monumental terms. One might almost forget that the countless banks in the United States and overseas have been financing Trump's semi-criminal business schemes for almost a half century, and long before he ascended to the White House. And that Joseph Biden, the decades-long senator from the great corporate tax haven of Delaware, was the author of countless socially regressive and oppressive laws. The New York Times, which only last month responded to Trump's well-deserved COVID-19 infection with an editorial urging his speedy recovery, how touching, presumes to lecture socialists on why they must support Biden, quote, without apology or embarrassment, and even with some excitement, end of quote. The Socialist Equality Party rejects with contempt the cynical appeals for class collaboration, for the abandonment of an independent class standpoint. It is not that the Socialist Equality Party underestimates the dangers represented by Trump. Quite the opposite. The SEP has continuously warned that Trump is seeking to build a fascistic movement. But we have also explained that Trump is not merely a crazed and vicious gangster, but the product of the crisis and contradictions of capitalism. The fight against Trump and the emergence of American fascism cannot be developed, let alone be successful, as long as the working class is politically tied to the Democratic Party. The SEP has a policy not only for November 3rd, but for all the days that follow the elections. Kishore and Norissa Santa Cruz and the other speakers will explain in greater detail the policies of our party. They will examine different aspects of the political crisis, but they will all emphasize that the only effective response to Trump's efforts to create a fascistic regime is one that is based on the independent social and political mobilization of the working class. And that mobilization must begin by preparing mass popular resistance to any attempt by Trump and the fascist gangs that are working with his encouragement to suppress votes and overturn the results of the election. There will be no return to normal after November 3rd. The extreme tension that surrounds this election is an expression of the explosive state of American society. Capitalism, riven by social inequality, driving toward war, is incompatible with democracy. If democracy is to survive in the United States, it must be reconstituted on an entirely new, that is, socialist foundations. That is why we hope that after hearing today's speakers, all those who are participating in this webinar will make the decision to join the Socialist Equality Party. I want to make, however, the following point. We are not miracle workers. We don't make promises. We don't promise instantaneous cures. We are confronting a vast historical crisis upon which hinges the fate of humanity. There is no easy solution. We are a revolutionary party because we tell the working class the truth. If the workers are to prevent the establishment of the most horrific dictatorship the world has ever seen, one that would even put Hitler to shame, then it must take up the fight for power. And those who are listening, who agree with this perspective, must make the most serious decision you will ever make in your life. And that is to build the only type of movement that can save humanity from catastrophe. That is a movement that is fighting to put an end to capitalism, that bases itself on the lessons of history, that has confidence in the strength of the working class, and understands what its responsibility as a political party is. Trotsky said it very well and very simply in 1933 when he was speaking of the danger of fascism coming to the United States. He said the workers will have to accept socialism or they'll be forced to accept fascism. We must tell the truth. We can only take responsibility for ourselves. And that is the conception that has guided our movement. We have fought throughout this campaign to explain the political issues to the working class. The quotes that I have provided are just a small number of literally hundreds of articles and statements that we have published this year. Every word we have published has been vindicated by events. And so we can speak with some confidence about what will come in the future. We are not just working for November 3rd or November 4th or for the month of November. We are preparing for the great struggles that lie ahead. And we are confident that to the extent that we are able to bring our political line to the attention of the working class, we fight for that, we will find an ever greater response as workers come to recognize the correctness of our analysis. And so with that, I'm very proud to begin introducing the speakers who will participate in this rally. First of all, I'd like to introduce Comrade Chris Marsden, the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party in Great Britain. He is well qualified to address this rally. Not only, of course, is he a leading figure in the International Committee of the Fourth International, but the British section itself has been going through great political struggles against the consequences of the betrayals of the Labour Party, of the trade unions, and fighting to resolve as well under difficult circumstances the crisis of political leadership. And so I think that Comrade Chris's remarks will be of immense value to our movement in the United States and helping us understand the world situation within which we presently are conducting the struggle for a socialist program and orientation. Comrade Chris.
Thank you, Comrade Dave. I'm going to address not just the situation in Britain, but also in Europe. There is, of course, an intense interest in the US presidential election, in Europe's parliaments, its boardrooms, and among all its citizens. Politics in the United States is, after all, always world politics. It's a nation that sits at the very center of the imperialist world order, and what happens there has an impact on every country in the world and on every person on the planet. But this is truer today than any time in history. For this election takes place under conditions where, to quote Yeats's suitably apocalyptic vision, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Amid a pandemic that's once again raging out of control and a mounting economic catastrophe, there is taking place an extraordinary attempt by the US and world's media and all of its political representatives to conceal the full extent of the crisis gripping America. But that doesn't mean it is not understood in ruling circles, and that millions of workers are not intensely engaged and concerned over what they have seen since before Trump came to power, during his entire term in office, and above all during the pandemic. Europe's workers have already understood very well that the American dream has become the American nightmare, the scene of mass deaths from COVID-19, of rampant social inequality, militarism, and police violence. We here in the Socialist Equality Party have formulated the impact of this objective shift in the position of US imperialism, its impact on Europe's rival imperialist powers, and on the political consciousness of workers the world over. Our soon-to-be published Congress resolution states the following: events in the United States will reverberate around the world. US imperialism has occupied a pivotal position in the imperialist world order, acting as the economic linchpin of the post-Second World War restabilization of capitalism. Its existential crisis will deliver a blow to the imperialist powers everywhere, provoking a steeper descent into trade war and military conflict. We continue. Washington was also the central actor in the Cold War against the Soviet Union and the architect of every military attack and political conspiracy against the revolutionary strivings of the world's workers and oppressed masses. The US has long been held up as the exemplar of the superiority of capitalism over socialism, especially in the aftermath of the destruction of the Soviet Union by Stalinism. The eruption of class struggle by the American working class will prove to be a spur to the developing socialist aspirations of workers everywhere. Now, to address these points, relations between the United States and Europe have undergone an unprecedented deterioration since Trump came to power. On January the 19th, 2017, one day before Trump's inauguration, I wrote on the World Socialist Web Site, "Never before has a US president set as his explicit goal the breakup of the European Union. Trump's America First positions represent a seismic shift in US political relations with Europe. Sections of the US bourgeoisie continue to be deeply opposed to Trump's attacks on the EU and Germany. But regardless of such disagreements, the US is being objectively driven on a steep trajectory towards trade war and protectionism to counter the threat to its global hegemony due to economic decline, the challenge posed by the rise of China and other rival powers, and a series of military debacles suffered since 2003. This must inevitably provoke conflict with Europe." Now, this has been the pattern of US-European relations ever since, exemplified in German Chancellor Angela Merkel's 2017 declaration in Munich that, quote, "The era in which we could fully rely on others is over to some extent. We Europeans truly have to take our fate into our own hands." Now, this hostile turn has included Trump's support for Brexit, that is Britain's leaving the European Union, trade war measures on both sides, threats to the NATO military alliance, demands for the European powers to step up their military spending, to break off nuclear talks with Iran and impose sanctions, curtail trade with China, especially involving the 5G network, travel bans imposed on both sides during the pandemic, and so on. In July, Trump announced the US was withdrawing 12,000 troops from Germany while castigating publicly Berlin for its low defense spending. Conflicts even led to the unprecedented and, I might say, entirely hypocritical criticism of Trump's response to the George Floyd protests, with German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas describing the protests as legitimate and warning Democrats must never escalate, not even through words. Threatening violence only triggers further violence. It was in fact Maas who declared earlier, "The response to America first is Europe united." Trump underscored these raging tensions in the final week of the presidential campaigning by inviting the clownish Brexit advocate Nigel Farage as guest speaker in Arizona and calling him the King of Europe. Now, the fascistic Mr. Farage responded by calling Trump, quote, "the only current leader in the free world who has got the guts to stand up and fight for the nation state, to fight for patriotism, to fight against globalism, the only leader in the Western world with the real courage to stand up to the Chinese Communist Party." That is what Trump means for the most reactionary and right-wing sections of the bourgeoisie the world over. And to be sure, Trump has other supporters in Europe. Boris Johnson's post-Brexit strategy of securing a trade deal with the United States will be left in ruins should Trump lose. Biden recently told the Chatham House military think tank in Britain, quote, "US interests are diminished with Great Britain not an integral part of Europe." Moreover, the likes of Viktor Orban in Hungary and far-right leaders in other East European states see Trump as an ally in their conflict with Germany and France. But for the most part, Europe's antagonisms with the US translate into a hope that a Biden victory might lead to a return to normalcy, a less unilateralist America, and a lessening of trade and military hostilities. An article in the Independent newspaper in the UK, based on interviews with European diplomats, summed up the situation as: President Trump is the first modern US president to undermine European integration, to view the EU as a threat, and to inject conditionality into NATO. Europeans worry things will get worse if Trump is re-elected. As another envoy says, our quote, fear is we have not hit rock bottom yet. Now, there is, however, an element of self-delusion in the hopes being pinned on Biden within European ruling circles. He is no less a representative of US imperialist interests than Trump, and will make his own demands on Europe, including on trade, military spending, and escalating conflicts with China and Russia that are such an essential part of the Democrats' differences with Trump as the representatives of the military and foreign policy establishment. The business website Bloomberg recently commented, quote, transatlantic relations started fraying long before Trump. They almost snapped during the administration of George W. Bush before Barack Obama restored them a bit. Even that was largely cosmetic. Trump simply blew the diplomatic sheen and subtlety off these disputes. The previously cited article in The Independent agreed, noting, quote, Trump's style and unpopularity in Europe obscures an uncomfortable reality for Europeans that many EU-US tensions are also the product of a longer-term, more structural divergence of US and European interests than of America's 45th president. The EU will continue to be at loggerheads with the US on trade and military policy. It is a choice to be made regarding the relative importance of the 384 billion euros of EU goods imported to the US and the 232 billion euros imported in 2019, a trade surplus of 152 billion euros, measured against sacrificing its fight for a share of the $14 trillion Chinese economy. All of these tensions are explosive. All of them are extraordinarily dangerous. The position of the European working class on the presidential elections is determined above all by hostility to Trump's nationalism, his authoritarianism, and above all, the widespread revulsion generated by his truly criminal response to the pandemic and his brutal suppression of the George Floyd protests. These protests were supported around the world by workers and young people with their own bitter experiences of police violence and the official encouragement of racism, xenophobia, and the far right. Europe has seen the rise of the fascist parties to government in the East and to the position of official opposition in France, Italy, and Germany, with the rise of Alternative for Germany under the protection of the state apparatus. Trump is seen as the embodiment of these reactionary processes. A recent YouGov survey of 7 European countries, that is Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Denmark, and Sweden, found that a Biden victory is desired by 80% of respondents in Denmark and 61% in the UK. Only 6% and 13% actually want Trump to win. The rest don't know. Trump's election campaign was described as, quote, mostly dishonest by between 47 and 74% of respondents. Large majorities in each country think Trump has been a poor or terrible president and has had a negative impact on their own country, the world, and even themselves personally. Even so, the attitude to Biden is far from enthusiastic. Only 17 to 23% across Europe feel he would make a good or great president, and between 21 and 25% had no clue what he would be like. This is, of course, something that we must remedy by clarifying Biden's role as a right-wing enemy of workers everywhere. But of great political significance in this poll was the response to the question of whether the election would be, quote, completely free and fair. Across all respondents, only 11% believed they would, with Britons, French, Germans and Swedes the most sceptical. This conclusion has been reached despite all efforts to downplay the dangerous implications of Trump's efforts to cultivate a fascistic base and to try and steal the election if he loses. There have been some pieces written which pose the issues with the necessary seriousness. In The Independent of June the 7th, 2019, Patrick Coburn asks, is Donald Trump a fascist? He rejected all casual dismissals that he is not as bad as Hitler, as dodging the issues, writing, and I quote, fascism was the product of a cataclysmic period in the first half of the 20th century that is very different from today. The US failed to get its way in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but these were small-scale conflicts in no way comparable to the First World War. The recession that followed the 2008 crash was a blip compared to the 30s. He then says, many of the better off reassure themselves with such thoughts, but they underestimate the destructiveness of deindustrialization and technological change for great numbers across the globe. Inequality has vastly increased. Economies expand, but the benefits are skewed toward the wealthy. Metropolitan centers plugged into the global economy flourished, but not their periphery. The distinction between winners and losers varies from country to country, but governments everywhere underestimated the unhappiness caused by social and economic upheaval. Beneficiaries of the status quo invariably downplay the significance of fault lines that populists are swift to identify and exploit. Experience shows that populist authoritarian nationalism, what Nehemiah called Caesarean democracy, is not a static phenomenon. It may not begin with all the fascist characterization listed above, but its trajectory is always in their direction. Regimes become more nationalistic, authoritarian, demagogic, shifting from intolerance and criticism or opposition to a determination to extinguish it entirely. Now, this, of course, was written before the pandemic and before the terrible events of this year. It hardly needs saying that such analyses are few and far between, and they only underscore the significance of the chorus of denials of a fascist threat coming from the pseudo-left groups. Alex Kalinikos, leader of Britain's largest such group, the Socialist Workers' Party, wrote recently, Trump isn't a fascist, but he's building fascism in the US, whatever that means. But he then stressed that there was no real cause for concern because Trump is, quote, too obsessed with his personal status and wealth to be interested in creating a new regime. In every instance, the social impulse behind such cynical appeals for calm is to maintain the existing social order from which they benefit as representatives of privileged layers of the middle class by keeping the working class politically tied to the trade union bureaucracy and to capitalist parties such as the Democrats in the US and Labour in Britain. All of this makes clear the extraordinary political significance of the work being conducted by the Socialist Equality Party, the election campaign for our dear comrades Joseph Kishore for president and Norissa Santa Cruz for vice president, and the daily reports and analysis of the political situation that appear on the World Socialist Web Site. The warnings made by the SEP of the far-right threat, its struggle to mobilize the independent political strength of the US working class, is a call to arms for workers the world over. The explosion of working class opposition that Trump's government of oligarchs and warmongers has provoked will provide the most powerful accelerant for the struggles of the European and international working class. And this will continue whatever happens on November the 3rd. The United States is only the most advanced expression of contradictions developing the world over. The unprecedented transfer of wealth to the super rich and the immiseration of the working class made worse during the pandemic is not possible by democratic means, because the mass resistance this will inevitably provoke must be crushed. What is unfolding in the US, Europe and internationally, therefore, is a massive confrontation between the parties of the corporate and financial aristocracy, whatever their formal designation, and the working class that must now assume revolutionary dimensions. In the next period, the workers of Europe must assume responsibility for opposing the drive to austerity, to dictatorship, the re-emergence of fascism, militarism and war prepared by all the imperialist powers, and their criminal sacrifice of life and looting of social wealth during the pandemic. They must do so by consciously uniting their struggles with those of the powerful battalions of workers in the United States and with workers internationally under the leadership of the International Committee of the Fourth International. I thank you very much for allowing me to address this election rally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Our next speaker is the presidential candidate of the Socialist Equality Party, Joseph Kishore, who is also the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party, a position that he assumed in 2008 when at the founding conference of the SEP. Comrade Joe joined the SEP on the eve of the 21st century and has accumulated in his years in the Trotskyist movement an enormous amount of political experience and authority. Many of his statements and articles, of course, are read by our readers, published on the World Socialist Web Site. And today he will speak at greater length on the political analysis of the SEP and the principles that have motivated this election campaign. Comrade Joe.
Thank you, Comrade North, and greetings to all who are participating in this rally and final election meeting today. The United States elections are being held under conditions of truly extraordinary social, economic, and political crisis. Whatever happens in the coming days and weeks, there is no going back to the status quo. The alternative confronting workers in the United States and indeed internationally is socialist revolution or capitalist barbarism. As the election comes to an end, the coronavirus pandemic is spiraling out of control. The Socialist Equality Party and the World Socialist Web Site have defined the pandemic as a trigger event. That is, an event that is accelerating and bringing to a head all the underlying contradictions of the world capitalist system. The virus is natural in origin, but its effects are bound up with the society in which it has emerged. It is exposing the consequences of decades of social reaction and the endless diversion of resources into the financial markets and the instruments of militarism and war. It is revealing the nature of capitalist society, a society dominated by a financial oligarchy whose control is no longer compatible with democratic forms of rule. And it is propelling millions of workers throughout the world into social and political struggle. The average number of daily new cases now is approaching 500,000. The average daily death toll, according to official figures, which vastly understate reality, is above 6,000. Already, nearly 1.2 million people have died from the coronavirus. After a drop in the summer months, new cases throughout Europe are at record levels. In Italy, new cases peaked on Friday at over 30,000, more than 5 times the level in March, when the explosion of deaths, which were transmitted in photographs and horrific images throughout the world, forced a shutdown of the entire country. No country, however, has proven more incapable of safeguarding public health than the United States, which has 4% of the world's population, but nearly a quarter of deaths from COVID-19. more than 236,000 people have died from the coronavirus in the United States, and 1,000 more are added to this horrific toll every day. The number of infections is approaching 10 million, increasing by more than 10% in just the past 2 weeks. The virus is spreading without restraint throughout the country, and hospitals in Texas, Wisconsin, and other states are reaching or have surpassed capacity. At the same time, the pandemic and the response of the ruling class to it have created a social crisis in the United States unlike anything that has been seen since the Great Depression. According to official figures, 13 million people are unemployed in the United States, 7 million more than before the pandemic hit. 2.5 million people have been unemployed for more than 27 weeks, and this figure is rising at a faster rate than at any point in recorded history. The number of people in poverty has increased by 8 million since May, and 10% of the adult population now reports that it cannot buy enough food. Amidst a deadly pandemic, nearly 1/5 of households report that they are not getting needed medical care because of the cost, while nearly half report that they are struggling to cover basic expenses and bills. Same time, mass layoffs are accelerating as the ruling class uses the conditions of the pandemic to implement far-reaching changes aimed at boosting profitability. The economic consequences of the pandemic are having a permanent and devastating impact on an entire generation of young workers who are predominantly employed in the gig and service sectors. This catastrophe is the product of definite policies pursued by the ruling class over the past 10 months. The financial oligarchy is implementing a policy of mass death and social devastation. After first downplaying the danger, the pandemic was utilized to implement the largest transfer of wealth into the pockets of the rich in world history, far surpassing even what was done following the 2008 financial collapse. The printing presses of the Federal Reserve have been turned over to Wall Street to the tune of trillions of dollars. Bank profits are surging to record levels. Morgan Stanley just announced last month that its profits have risen 25% compared to a year ago. Goldman Sachs is doing better. Its profits have nearly doubled. The wealth of the corporate and financial oligarchy has soared to new heights. Since the end of February, Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, has increased his net worth by nearly $80 billion. Now, it is impossible to understand the political situation in the United States on the eve of this election outside of this social reality. The final weeks of the election campaign have made clear, as the World Socialist Web Site has said, Trump is not running for president, he is running for Führer. The White House is at the center of a conspiracy to ignore the election results, stoke fascistic violence, and utilize the courts to overturn the popular vote. It is less than 1 month since the initial exposure of a fascistic plot to kidnap and murder the governors of Michigan and Virginia and other states, plots that were encouraged and incited at the highest levels of the state. The plots grew out of the anti-lockdown demonstrations in April and May, which followed the bailout of Wall Street, as the ruling class was implementing its back to work campaign. The demonstrations were encouraged by Trump's calls to liberate Michigan, Virginia, and Minnesota from any restraints on the spread of the coronavirus. Far-right organizations are being mobilized in order to implement and enforce the homicidal policy of the ruling elites. In the final days of the election, Trump is doing everything he can to delegitimize the results. If the results are not known by the evening of November 3rd, he said in Pennsylvania yesterday, quote, "You're going to have bedlam in our country." He denounced two recent Supreme Court decisions which at least temporarily allow the counting of mail-in ballots that arrive after Election Day. Quote, somebody's going to play games and they just got an extension. What's the extension all about? Wouldn't you like to hear November 3rd, we win or we lose? Trump has repeatedly insisted that the final results have to be announced on November 3rd, Election Day. In fact, there is nothing in the Constitution that requires a result on Tuesday. The winner of the election is determined after all ballots are counted. Pennsylvania, a battleground state, is a particular target. Trump asked yesterday, quote, are they going to mysteriously find more ballots after polls close? Strange things have been known to happen, especially in Philadelphia. This occurs as National Guard troops have been deployed to Philadelphia, where they will remain until after the election, following the eruption of protests over the latest incident of horrific police murder. Whatever happens over the coming weeks, Trump is clearly building a fascistic movement based upon extreme nationalism, anti-socialism, and authoritarianism, directly connected to the policy in relationship to the pandemic. In his campaign rallies, accompanied by chants of Superman, Trump is doing everything he can to downplay the threat to the lives of millions and millions of people, and in fact, encourage the spread of the virus. In recent days, he has claimed that doctors are deliberately falsifying the cause of deaths due to COVID-19 in order to make money, he claims. Trump's son, Donald Jr., declared in a recent interview that deaths from the virus are almost nothing, echoing Trump's earlier comment that the coronavirus supposedly affects virtually nobody. Now, while Trump is attempting to steal the election and incite far-right violence, the Democrats are doing everything they can to cover up the fundamental threat to democratic rights. At his own campaign events, Democratic candidate Joe Biden makes no mention of the election coup, the plot to kidnap and murder Whitmer and other governors, the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, which is clearly part of Trump's overall strategy over the next month, or anything else related to the threat to democratic rights in the election. Indeed, the Democratic Party played a central role in the ramming through of the nomination of Barrett by opposing anything, refusing to do anything to stop the nomination. The Democrats' cowardice in response to Trump's conspiracies is entirely bound up with their own opposition to any policies to address the spreading pandemic or the devastating social crisis. Beyond talking about masks, the Democrats have nothing to propose as they reject any measures that threaten the interests of the corporate and financial elite. The Democratic Party, a party of Wall Street and the military, is terrified of anything that will spark mass social unrest, which would threaten to develop into a movement not just against Trump, but the entire capitalist system. Now, the Democratic Party and the various pseudo-left organizations that surround it insist that in these elections, all the energy of workers and youth must be directed toward the election of Joe Biden. Only in this way, they claim, can there be a return to normalcy and an end to the disaster that has been produced by Trump. Completely absent from these arguments is any actual analysis of what the Democratic Party is, what class interests it represents, or the social and political conditions that have produced Trump himself. As I said, the Democratic Party is a party of Wall Street and the military. Indeed, as the election approaches, Biden's fundraising in the third quarter has benefited from an influx of money from the finance industry. For the past 4 years, the opposition of the Democratic Party to Trump has been focused not on his fascistic politics, but on the demand of dominant sections of the military and the intelligence agencies for a more militarist foreign policy against Russia and in the Middle East, which culminated in the Democrats' impeachment fiasco. Biden has the support of some of the leading world war criminals of American imperialism, people who have wreaked havoc on populations throughout the world, People like John Negroponte, the former US ambassador to Honduras, the former ambassador to Iraq, a leading figure in the Iraq War, the former director of national intelligence involved in domestic spying, people like Michael Hayden, the former director of the CIA, implicated in the construction of black site torture centers under Bush, people who were involved in the initial invasion of Iraq, both in 1991 and 2003, like Colin Powell. The policy of a Democratic administration will not be one of social reform, as the apologists for Biden claim, but brutal austerity. The 8 years of the Obama administration, in which Biden, of course, was vice president, saw a massive transfer of wealth to the rich following the 2008 economic and financial crisis. Indeed, it was the legacy of the 8 years of unending war and social reaction of the Obama administration, combined with the right-wing and militarist character of the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, that allowed Trump to posture demagogically as an opponent of the status quo. And it is in fact remarkable that as Trump engages in his fascistic plots, the layers around the Democratic Party have dedicated themselves to an extended effort aimed at attacking the democratic foundations of the United States and attacking the legacy of the American Revolution and the Civil War. The center of this campaign is the New York Times 1619 Project, a work of historical falsification that is aimed at presenting all of American history as a conflict among races and its connection to the politics of the present, which is the Democratic Party's politics of racial division. As for Bernie Sanders, what has become of his so-called political revolution? The central aim of Sanders' campaigns in both 2016 and 2020 has been to contain mass social anger and opposition to social inequality to both parties, to contain it within the framework of the Democratic Party and to ensure that it finds no genuine progressive expression. And he is performing that function now as a leading campaigner for Joe Biden. Now, to rely on the Democratic Party to defend democratic rights would be suicidal. Moreover, nowhere in the media and the political establishment is there any serious analysis of the social and political conditions that have produced this unprecedented crisis and breakdown of American democracy. Trump is somehow presented as some sort of demon from hell. To paraphrase Trotsky writing about Hitler, they claim that if it were not for Trump, American democracy would blossom like a garden. What a contemptible lie. Trump is himself an expression of a far deeper disease. For decades, the ruling class has been engaged in a single-minded pursuit of ripping up social programs and transferring wealth to the rich. Beginning in the late 1970s and 1980s, the ruling elites launched an offensive to destroy all of the gains that workers had won through bitter struggle. Endless resources have been channeled into the financial markets through deindustrialization and the ripping up of social infrastructure. As a consequence, social inequality has reached levels not seen since before the Great Depression. With the crucial assistance of the trade unions, those corporatist entities and arms of corporate management posturing as workers' organizations, with the critical assistance of the trade unions, working class opposition to this social counter-revolution has been suppressed. As a result, excuse me, as a result, the national income share for the bottom half of the population fell from 20% in 1980 to 12% in 2014, while the income share for the top 1% rose from 12% to 20%. Wealth and income is even more heavily concentrated in the top 0.1 and top 0.01% of the population. At the same time, the American ruling class responded to the dissolution of the USSR with an orgy of speculation and militarism. The terrorist attacks of September 11th were seized on to invade Afghanistan and then Iraq. More than 1 million people were killed in the so-called war on terror. Torture was instituted as official government spying policy. NSA spying on the population became a central element of the conspiracy against democratic rights. The persecution of Julian Assange, supported by the entire political establishment and in fact spearheaded by the Democratic Party. Assange, who remains in prison in the United Kingdom, subject to trumped-up charges. All of this, all of the crimes of American capitalism, of American imperialism, all the inequality, all the violence at home and abroad, all of this is now coming to a head. Historians will look back at the 2020 elections as both a continuation and a new stage in the protracted crisis of American democracy. Now, there are various scenarios for what will play out over the next several days on election day and after. What can be ruled out, however, is that somehow the political crisis in the United States is going to be resolved peacefully. Whether or not Trump is in the White House come January, the mobilization of fascistic organizations is now a fact of American political life. The pandemic will continue to rage, and there is no faction of the ruling class that proposes anything that will stop it. What happens, however, cannot be separated from the development of the class struggle. The working class will not and cannot remain a bystander in events. It must prepare to respond through its own independent initiative. Any attempt by Trump to steal the election in defiance of the popular vote will certainly be met with mass demonstrations. The working class must intervene through the method of class struggle. It must oppose Trump's coup plotting and the incitement of fascistic violence through strike action, including preparations for a political general strike. Opposition to Trump's conspiracies must be connected to the independent interference of the working class on the basis of a program that represents its own interests. Now, the working class requires a perspective not just for November 3rd, but for November 4th and beyond. At the beginning of this year, we published a statement in the World Socialist Web Site, "The Decade of Socialist Revolution Begins." And this was before the pandemic emerged as a global crisis. We called attention to the essential characteristics of the world situation that had developed over the previous decade: the institutionalization of unending military conflict and the growing danger of world war, the breakdown of democracy and the rise of the far right internationally, the degradation of the environment and the growing danger of climate change, and the extreme growth of social inequality, particularly following the 2008 economic crisis. We wrote, quote, "The objective conditions for socialist revolution emerge out of the global crisis. The approach of social revolution has already been foreshadowed in the mass demonstrations and strikes that swept across the globe in 2019. In Mexico, Puerto Rico, Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, France, Spain, Algeria, Britain, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Sudan, Kenya, South Africa, India, and Hong Kong. The United States, where the entire political structure is directed toward the suppression of class struggle, witnessed the first national strike by auto workers in more than 40 years, end quote. The dominant and most revolutionary feature of the development of the class struggle, we explained, was its global character. The working class is an international class that has grown enormously over the past 2 decades and is united like never before through the process of production and advances in communications. We explain, quote, "The growth of the working class and the emergence of class struggle on an international scale are the objective basis for revolution. However, the spontaneous struggles of workers and their instinctive striving for socialism are by themselves inadequate. The transformation of the class struggle into a conscious movement for socialism is a question of political leadership," end quote. Now, when we launched the Socialist Equality Party election campaign later that same month, at the end of January, we explained that its central task was the fight for a socialist program and perspective for the working class, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. Then the global pandemic hit. As with everything else, the pandemic had a significant impact on our election campaign. We decided very early on to cancel all of our in-person election meetings and our travel plans in the United States and internationally. We also decided that we could not petition to get on the ballot, as attempting to meet the already anti-democratic restrictions in the United States, which require the gathering of thousands and thousands of signatures just to get on the ballot, that meeting those restrictions would have deadly consequences in the midst of a pandemic. The courts and the Democratic Party, the courts and Democratic Party state governments defended these restrictions. Whitmer, the target of the fascistic coup plot, even referenced the anti-lockdown rallies in the spring to argue that the Socialist Equality Party should have and could have gone out to gather signatures. While the judge in the case complained of gyms being shut down, the same complaint of the militiamen. While the form of our campaign changed as a result of the pandemic, the essential content remained. Indeed, the pandemic and the response of the ruling class to it has demonstrated that the perspective advanced by the Socialist Equality Party, and only the Socialist Equality Party, is the way forward for the working class. We say to workers and youth who are listening in on this meeting, the central conclusion that must be drawn from the experiences of this year is to join the Socialist Equality Party. You know what is happening in your plants and workplaces. The ruling class is using the pandemic to carry out a massive restructuring of class relations, increasing exploitation. The capitalist class has contempt for the lives of workers, forcing you to choose between starvation and sacrificing your lives for profit. You see what Trump is doing. You see the conspiracies that are being carried out that are directed above all at opposition from workers. You know that there is growing anger over inequality and exploitation, unemployment, police violence, the attack on democratic rights, and endless war. The conclusion that must be drawn is the need to build a socialist leadership. The struggles of workers cannot be advanced unless such a leadership is built. A political movement must be developed that takes direct aim at the source of the crisis, the capitalist system. The fight against the pandemic must be waged on the basis of a program for the massive redistribution of wealth. The ill-gotten gains of the oligarchs must be seized in order to finance universal healthcare and other critically needed social infrastructure. Non-essential production must be shut down until the pandemic is under control. And all workers must receive full income and be protected from eviction. Where production is essential to the functioning of societies, workplaces must be made safe, with conditions overseen by the workers themselves in consultation with healthcare professionals. To organize society on the basis of social need and not private profit, the gigantic banks and corporations must be turned into public utilities. World economy must be restructured on the basis of a scientific and rational plan. And to carry out this program, the working class must take political power in its own hands to establish a government of, by, and for the workers. To organize the struggles of the working class, the Socialist Equality Party is spearheading the fight for the formation of rank and file factory and workplace committees, independent of the corporatist trade unions. It fights to unify the working class in opposition to all efforts to divide it along racial, gender, or national lines. There is no national solution to this global pandemic, as there is no national solution to any of the great problems confronting the working class: inequality, exploitation, war, environmental degradation. The building of a mass socialist movement in the American working class must be connected to the mobilization of billions of workers throughout the world, the massive social force that can chart a new way forward for mankind. To meet the challenges that are posed to the working class, a new movement must be built, a political movement based not on pragmatic and empty hopes, but on a scientific analysis of the nature of capitalist society. It must be a movement that is based on an assimilation of the great lessons of history, a movement that understands that to the crisis of capitalism, the working class must respond with the perspective of socialist revolution. The leadership of this movement is the Socialist Equality Party and the International Committee of the Fourth International. So in concluding, I would encourage all of you, if you have not voted already, to vote for the Socialist Equality Party candidates, Norissa Santa Cruz and myself, in these elections. But most importantly, make the decision to join the Socialist Equality Party and take up an active fight for the building of a socialist leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I'd like to appeal to all those who are watching this rally and participating in it. First of all, again, to make the decision to join the Socialist Equality Party. This movement must be built. It requires your participation. To those of you who are listening within the United States, and I must make this proviso because of reactionary American laws, we'd like to ask you to make the largest possible donation to this election campaign. Obviously, it has cost resources. And so please send your donations to socialism2020.org/donate. We can only accept contributions from within the United States, from Americans. So please, that's a law which we have to adhere to. But please make such a donation. We really require these funds to conduct our political work. Our next speaker will be Eric London, a reporter and political analyst for the World Socialist Web Site. Comrade London has written a great deal on the conspiracy involving militias and fascistic groups in Michigan. And our reporting really has been the most extensive. This has been an event which has been largely ignored in the capitalist media, but it is one which must be followed carefully and understood. So I'd like to ask Comrade Eric if he could now review these very, very important developments with the audience. Comrade Eric.
Thank you, Comrade David. With less than 48 hours remaining before Election Day, as comrades have already noted on this call, Donald Trump is not so much running an election campaign as he is attempting to establish a presidential dictatorship. He broadcasts this plan every day in semi-literate English at his super spreader campaign rallies being held across the Midwest. He wants to mobilize fascist militia to seize governors and battleground state capitals, deploy police to crush protests in the major cities where the most of the population of the country lives, and to rely on the Supreme Court to sanction election robbery for the second time in 20 years. And while we can't predict exactly what is going to happen on Tuesday and in its aftermath, what is clear is that the least likely outcome is one in which everything runs smoothly. American democracy, or whatever little remained of it, is rotting on its feet. Trump's baseless claims that mail-in ballots are fraudulent echo the attitude of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, who once said the aim of the slaveholders' rebellion after the election of Lincoln in 1860 was, quote, to rid itself of the rule of the majority. Now, the fact that Trump's strategy even seems plausible confirms that this sick capitalist social order cannot be made healthy except by a complete revolutionary overhaul. The most harrowing example of this is what the corporate media refers to the least, that is, the fascist plot to assassinate sitting governors. Earlier this month, the FBI raided a dozen Michigan towns and revealed a plot to kidnap and kill the state's Democratic governor, Gretchen Whitmer. What is involved is a serious national conspiracy to decapitate Trump's political opponents. The Michigan plotters planned not only to kill Whitmer, but also Virginia's Democratic Governor Ralph Northam. And after the plot became known, Trump has only escalated attacks on Whitmer and the other governors, calling her a dictator and a tyrant for implementing lockdown measures, repeating verbatim the language used by the plotters themselves. Court documents show the Michigan plotters also discussed the possibility of attacking Republican South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster and North Carolina's Democratic Governor Roy Cooper. And in addition, a woman with close ties to the Republican Party also planned to kidnap Ohio Republican Governor Mike DeWine. And at least some of the plotters, we know from affidavits, were engaged in discussions with broader militia in Texas and with the far-right Oath Keeper groups in Georgia and Wisconsin. Last week, the FBI raided a fascist training camp used by neo-Nazis in Michigan to prepare for election violence. Death threats were also made against Kentucky's Democratic Governor Andy Beshear, in the state where we recently learned that police training presentations often include quotes from Adolf Hitler. Now, Jacobin magazine, the semi-official organ of the Democratic Socialists of America, seeks to downplay this danger, writing after the raids in Michigan that the plot is exaggerated and that the media is engaged in sensationalism and that there's really no threat of far-right violence today. This is the demoralized and language of the complacent and affluent apologists for Biden, whose position is basically, there's nothing to see here, move along. Trump's major constituency from dictatorship also comes from within the police and national security apparatus, whose attitude towards social opposition can basically be defined as bring the war on terror home to America's streets. Trump is appealing to the nearly 1 million police officers and immigration agents who are armed with the same tanks, assault rifles, and drones that were used by the US military on the populations of Fallujah and Baghdad and in Kabul and Kandahar. There's a network of sheriffs and police officers tied to Trump confidants Joe Arpaio and David Clark, who have defended the actions of the Michigan plotters, while in Minnesota, police are coordinating with Trump lawyers to interrupt voting in poor neighborhoods. In Battleground, Arizona, a police officer was recently put on desk duty after plotting to murder the Democratic mayor of Phoenix, Arizona. And police in Michigan are refusing to obey state leadership by allowing militia to carry weapons into polling places on election day. Playing into Trump's hands, the Democratic mayors in cities like Chicago and New York are deploying thousands of police to the streets on election day to prepare to stop protests. Powerful sections of big business have also deliberately cultivated the far right to threaten and pressure officials who implemented even the most modest measures to confront the pandemic, which has now claimed over 236,000 lives in the US alone. In March, strikes by auto workers, meat packers, and teachers prompted these first lockdowns. And within weeks, in response, the ruling class planned a series of anti-lockdown demonstrations for state capitals in April. They appealed to the most backward, anti-scientific sentiments and anti-communist sentiments that have long lingered in the United States and have sought to provide space for far-right networks to plot acts of violence. Those demonstrations were funded by organizations associated with the DeVos family, the Koch brothers, and other dark money billionaire networks who intend to cultivate the far right to crush working class opposition and force through the deadly policy of herd immunity. Many must be thinking, how did this happen? How did the United States, which once called itself, or tried to present itself at least, as the land of unlimited opportunity, and presented itself to the world as a beacon of democracy, how did this become the land of would-be fascist putschs and conspirators? These far-right layers, with Trump at their head, are the product of 30 years of unending war and bipartisan capitalist reaction, which have seeped into the political culture like toxic waste into the soil, poisoning everything it touches. This is a ruling class which has killed over 1 million people in the wars of the last 20 years. The ruling class has ruined Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, Libya, Somalia. It has strangled Iran and Venezuela. It has carried out massacres and drone murders and awarded the killers with medals. It passed the Patriot Act, and it spies on the entire world's population. It passed the bank bailouts while evicting millions from their homes. It has deported millions of exploited people back to the war-torn homelands, keeps immigrant children in cages, and locks up millions more of its own impoverished citizens in jails or prisons, or watches them through their whole lives on parole or probation. It's overthrown democratically elected governments around the world, imposed dictatorships, and tortured its opponents in black site prisons. There was no opposition to these measures from within the political establishment. They had the enthusiastic support of all the patriotic and wealthy media talking heads. The courts approved it all, and the trade unions accepted it all. And those courageous enough to oppose it, as Comrade Joseph has said, like Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning, were locked up, while the World Socialist Web Site faces censorship today from the media giants. So the ruling class may not like looking the fascist thugs in the face, but the men who plan to kill Gretchen Whitmer are American capitalism's portrait of Dorian Gray, the reflection of the class whose interests they serve, and the product of a long rap sheet of US imperialism's crimes. Trump's greatest strength today is the spinelessness of the so-called opposition. As Comrade Joe has already indicated, he calculates that the Democratic Party and corporate media are too afraid of social opposition from below to launch any real popular mobilization to stop him. And it's true, the Democrats have systematically covered up the plots in Michigan and elsewhere, downplaying their significance and hiding the details from the population. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris hardly mention the conspiracy to assassinate governors and mayors from their own party in their stump speeches. The Democrats are far more concerned with the threat from the left than the clear and present danger from the far right. In an article published Friday in the New York Times, Ron Suskind wrote that the danger on election day, the danger of mayhem, is that, quote, groups from the left may emerge as well, most likely as a counterpoint to those on the right. As a senior official told me, the numbers on the left are vast, end quote. Contrary to the arguments of those who say the Democratic Party can be pressured, in actual fact, the more pressure there is from the left, the faster and more easily the Democratic Party capitulates to the right. Neither faction of the ruling class has forgotten that before the outbreak of the pandemic, the world was witnessing mass protests on an unprecedented scale. The streets of Santiago, San Juan, Algiers, Paris, Khartoum, Beirut, and countless other cities were filled with protesters of all races and ethnicities. Now another wave of global protest is emerging across the United States this summer, as well as in Lagos, Nigeria, and Bangkok, Thailand in recent weeks. The fundamental issue that has driven workers of all backgrounds into the street, and many of them to die at the hands of their security forces, are not racial issues, sectarian issues, or questions of gender or sexual identity, the hobby horses of the satisfied upper middle class, but massive levels of social inequality, greatly exacerbated by the pandemic itself. In a recent study, political scientists Jack Goldstone and Peter Turchin explain that the world is entering into what they call the turbulent 20s. In the United States, they write, quote, almost any election scenario this fall is likely to lead to popular protests on a scale we have not seen this century. They explain, quote, across history, what creates the risk of political instability is the behavior of elites who jealously hoard their wealth. Such selfish elites lead the way to revolutions, end quote. This is so, but not automatically. And as the mass demonstrations of the last 2 years have also demonstrated in the negative, the need for a revolutionary socialist leadership capable of explaining the historic origins of the present crisis and of correctly characterizing those opponents of the working class who masquerade as their friends. 22 years ago, in 1998, the same year the founding of the World Socialist Web Site, the website published an article by David North titled, "Is America Drifting Towards Civil War?" In this article, the WSWS sought to explain the global political and economic tendencies that produced the conditions leading to the anti-democratic impeachment of President Bill Clinton by the Republicans. Explaining the basic class character of the Democratic Party's response to the impeachment, we wrote, quote, "The social base of the Democratic Party has been affected by the same economic and social processes that have driven the Republican Party to the right. The Democratic Party is incapable of defending itself because a genuine struggle against the impeachment drive would require exposing the political significance of the right-wing campaign to destabilize the Clinton administration, identifying the social forces behind it, and arousing a popular movement of opposition among working people. As a bourgeois party that defends the profit system, the Democratic Party can make no such appeal," end quote. These prescient words, which apply all the more forcefully today, could only be the product of a Marxist analysis. The processes identified at this early stage by the International Committee of the Fourth International are now far advanced. But Trump's plot is not destined to succeed because another process is developing, one far more powerful potentially than the backroom plotting of various elites. And that's the emergence of an increasingly international, interconnected, urban working class that is bursting with youth and energy, with a world of information literally in the palm of its hands in the form of mobile phones and the internet. The political education and common mobilization of this billion-strong social force is the key to the situation. It must be politically awakened and unified in a powerful movement against dictatorship, a movement capable of conquering the commanding heights of the capitalist economy and creating a truly equal and socialist society. All those who tell workers that the real fault line is not class, but religion, race, nationality, or gender, are opposed to this fight. These forces, especially when they try to present themselves as left-wing, must not be compromised with. They have to be unsparingly opposed. This is our task, and we need you to help us carry it out. To those listening, and especially to workers, teachers, auto workers, Amazon workers, and all others, join the Socialist Equality Party in the United States, join the section of the International Committee in your country, and link arms with us in the struggle for a socialist world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. Our next speaker will be the vice presidential candidate of the Socialist Equality Party, Norissa Santa Cruz. Norissa is an administrator in graduate education in California and a member of the Socialist Equality Party for nearly a decade. Norissa will address the great social crisis conditions of life which confront broad sections of the working class and which are being addressed in the election program of the Socialist Equality Party. Comrade Norissa.
Thank you, David, and greetings to all of our listeners around the world. I'd like to begin by addressing the worsening social crisis, which is unfolding simultaneously with the breakdown of democratic forms of rule. Now, it isn't any news to anyone that the state and the degree of suffering, of social misery faced by billions of workers and youth on this planet is on a scale not seen since the world wars. In the United States, the center of world capitalism and the richest country in the world, tens of millions are unemployed, face impoverishment, evictions, and homelessness, hunger, and the threat of utility shutoffs. All of this while the pandemic continues to rage on. Millions of the working poor teeter on the brink of ruin, and every day, thousands are cast into the whirlpool of destitution. While the official unemployment rate is at 8%, the real unemployment rate in America, the number of people looking for a full-time job that pays a living wage, but are unable to find one is at 26.1%. The $600 a week unemployment supplement that helped millions hold on for a while is long expired. A lost wage assistance program providing 6 meager payments of $300 is nearly dried up. Some 4.5 million workers in New York and California alone are set to lose lost wage benefits this month, and the program has already ended for millions more in over a dozen other states. Meanwhile, corporations continue to announce new rounds of mass layoffs, and those include recently 28,000 to be slashed from Walt Disney, 19,000 from Raytheon, 7,000 from Boeing. Wells Fargo plans an overall 20 to 25% reduction of its workforce, planning to slash 50 to 66,000 jobs worldwide. And layoffs from these 4 companies alone amount to 100,000 jobs, but affect millions of family members who depend on this income. And all of the indices point to the fact that the jobs bloodletting is still in its infancy. Already many states have begun imposing layoffs as well as instituting pay cuts. States face massive budget shortfalls as a result of drastic declines in revenue, and it's projected that state budget deficits will reach $434 billion by 2022 due to the pandemic. And these deficits will lead to an even larger state workforce reductions and the elimination of services. The dire situation facing the working class, youth, and children finds its expression in malnourishment for large sections of the population. In the United States alone, 50 million people struggle to meet basic nutrition needs every month. 22 million adults in the US, or 10% of the total adult population, report that they're not able to afford to buy enough food, and this figure is nearly triple the rate before the pandemic. Some 180 million families are at risk of utility shutoffs as the winter approaches and are making decisions whether to buy groceries or keep the lights on. These desperate figures reflect what is, of course, a global phenomenon. The UN recently reported that 132 million more people will go hungry worldwide this year due to the pandemic, driving the number of undernourished close to 1 billion, or 13% of the global population. In addition to the abysmal financial uncertainty, looms the threat of eviction for tens of millions. 34 million people were behind on their rent in September alone, totaling some $12 to $17 billion in unpaid rent, which is expected to triple by the new year. Completely undermining the federal moratorium on evictions currently in place for the remainder of the year, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention updated their eviction policies to allow landlords to begin administrative eviction processes to pressure early move-outs with the threat of legal fees and eviction orders that threaten to leave families with a black mark that follows them for at least a decade. The threat of evictions and the pain of hunger have forced millions back to work to eke out an existence, and in many cases as casual workers, as warehouse workers for Amazon, app-based delivery drivers, or some other sector in the gig economy. Additionally, an entire vulture-like industry has developed to profit from evictions, having desperate low-paid workers evict other workers and families in dire straits, and in disgusting fashion deemed itself the fastest growing money-making gig due to COVID-19. As has been stated, COVID has claimed the lives of over 1.2 million people on this planet. The majority are the working poor, who even prior to the pandemic lived with limited access to medical care or sick leave. In the US, at least 48% of all frontline workers are ineligible for sick pay. This means that they will not only suffer should they become ill, but they have no means to even protect themselves and their families should they need to quarantine for a few weeks, should they find out they've been exposed. Additionally, 43 million Americans have lost their employer-sponsored health care with the layoffs since March. There are thousands of bankruptcies taking place on a daily basis, and most tied to healthcare costs. Hundreds of thousands of GoFundMe pages have been built to help with COVID-19 medical bills and funeral expenses. This past week, the company created an entire section dedicated to rent, food, or bills, which speaks to the mountain of fundraisers that have been set up for families, single parents, and orphan children who find no assistance and have turned to ask the world for help to meet basic needs. The long-term impacts of losing a family member, and oftentimes the income of a vital breadwinner, will lead to millions of uncertain futures and financial struggles for years to come. It's already difficult to imagine, for instance, the long-term effects on a single family losing a member and income earner. But when magnified to the millions who have become ill and lost their lives throughout the globe, the weight of the suffering on families is almost incomprehensible. Marx's theory of increasing social misery finds its truest expression in the way in which capitalism has dealt with the pandemic and the callous loss of life. There's been no shortage of bus drivers, transit workers, agricultural workers, maquiladora factory workers, auto workers, food processing workers, and teachers who have tragically died, or who, by necessity, have also remained working despite being sick in the most dangerous conditions. Workers throughout the world have been sent to an early grave by a financial oligarchy that has enriched itself on their suffering. What is being carried out was correctly described by Engels in 1844 as social murder. There is hardly a mention by either Trump or Biden on the degree of devastation facing millions. While the ruling class has responded to the pandemic with criminal negligence, it's been extremely efficient in looking after the needs of the billionaires. The wealth of America's 643 richest rose by almost $1 trillion between March and September. And adding insult to injury, many major corporations gave their shareholders generous bonuses before filing for bankruptcy and getting bailed out with the huge sums by the CARES Act, all while laying off large sections of its workforce. While life has never been better for the billionaires, both parties are using the threat of homelessness and hunger to force workers back on the job so they can produce the profits to pay for their giant corporate bailout. It's within this situation of vast wealth inequality that the working class must come to understand that democracy is entirely incompatible in such an unequal society. Regardless of which section of the ruling elite should come to power Tuesday, the United States is and remains an oligarchy with a degree of wealth concentration that is historically unprecedented. It is capitalism that sees to the upward transfer and monopolization of wealth, and it is only the socialist reorganization of society that can change this. There is a false and dangerous conception that Biden or the Democrats will somehow save society from dictatorial forms of rule. But the drive of the Trump administration towards fascism and the cultivation of the extreme right cannot be understood except in relation to the class interests of this oligarchy. The Democrats, the other major faction within the bourgeoisie, will themselves line up behind the suppression of the working class when it begins to demand a society organized in its interest, in the interests of the working class. The Democratic Party, as Obama did when he sent military tanks into Ferguson following the protests in the wake of the police killing of Michael Brown, Democrats will not bat an eye to unleash the National Guard on protesters and do everything it can to stifle and suppress any opposition to capitalism. Both parties agree on the need to suppress any sign of opposition. And while Trump whips up xenophobia and far-right elements, the Democrats employ the politics of race and identity to smother the class struggle. They work to divert anger over racism and social inequality to advance the interests of a small layer of minorities in the top 10% who want a larger piece of the pie hoarded by the top 1%. Workers throughout the world must come to understand that these politics are deeply hostile to their interests, which are funded and promoted so heavily by the Democratic Party and are for a definite political purpose, which is to pit workers against each other. And workers must learn to reject this ideology, which seeks to prevent their multi-ethnic and international unity. It has been outlined that the Socialist Equality Party waged this election campaign as part of larger efforts to raise the consciousness of the working class and expose the reality that mass problems such as the pandemic, climate change, and global hunger require mass solutions that cannot be resolved without breaking the stranglehold of the capitalist oligarchy in every country. The fight must be for a global socialist reorganization of society. Trillions of dollars must be reappropriated from the bailout of Wall Street and used to route towards international scientific resources to battle the pandemic and address the massive economic and social crisis. What all who are listening to this event must come away with from this meeting is that this is the time to get off the sidelines, to get in touch with the section of the ICFI in your area, and make the decision to join the SEP and our global movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Norissa. As all the previous speakers have stressed, the strategy of the SEP bases itself on the revolutionary role of the working class. The American working class is among the most powerful of the battalions of the international working class, with an extraordinary history of social struggle. That class is beginning to move again. And the SEP has played a critical role in initiating a movement for the development of rank and file committees, independent of the reactionary labor bureaucracies, to mobilize the working class and struggle in defense of its rights, in defense of its safety, of its right to live. And it has provided a political orientation upon which that struggle must develop. Our next speaker, Tom Hall, is a staff reporter of the World Socialist Web Site, who's also played a very critical role in the coverage of the developing struggles of the working class. And he will discuss these developments in his remarks. Comrade Tom.
Thank you, Dave. And I'd like to start out by saying that it's a great honor to be able to speak at this very important final election meeting. Workers all over the world are beginning to fight back against the most serious crisis of the entire capitalist system since World War II. The pandemic, which follows several years of mounting strikes and other forms of social struggle by the working class, has seen the greatest eruption of social protest in decades. From wildcat strikes in the auto industry to growing opposition among teachers, and global protests spanning from Nigeria to Belarus to the United States against police brutality and political repression, millions of workers around the world are on the move. The coronavirus, as always, is a poor man's disease. When Donald Trump caught it, he immediately had access to the best medical care that money can buy. But workers, tens of millions of whom do not even have medical coverage in this country, can struggle even to pay for the cost of a test. Workers are also under intense financial pressure, especially after unemployment benefits were allowed to expire by Congress to remain on the job even after becoming infected. Schools and workplaces have served as centers for the spread of the disease into broader communities. Nearly 200,000 healthcare workers in the United States have been infected, and at least 750 nurses, doctors, and other frontline healthcare workers are dead. At least 48,000 infections and 200 deaths have occurred in meatpacking plants, which have also served as transmission vectors for the virus into rural areas of the country. More than 100,000 students and educational workers in K-12 schools are infected, including at least 5,000 in the state of Michigan alone. There are no reliable figures on the extent of the virus in the auto plants, owing
We seem to have a problem with the last speaker's transmission. We'll be trying to fix it and return to him, but we'll then move on to our next speaker, Comrade Genevieve Leigh, who's going to speak about the conditions of youth who are, of course, being profoundly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic and whose entire future is really under threat in the conditions which confront society. So I'm going to ask Comrade Genevieve to step in and deal with this change in schedule, and we'll try to get back to Tom as soon as possible. Comrade Genevieve.
Hi, thanks, David. As all the other speakers have illustrated, this election is taking place under extraordinary circumstances. There's immense uncertainty, nervousness as to what's going to happen on election day. And in the days, weeks, and months following, I think we all feel it in one way or another. For young people, the events of the past year have had a profound and irreversible impact on their political outlook, imprinting forever in their minds the realities of life under capitalism in the richest country in the world. Millions of workers and young people are gravely concerned for their own lives, for the lives of their loved ones, the well-being of their family and friends. They don't know if they're going to be able to pay the bills next week, next month, what they would do if they got sick or if a loved one got sick. Hundreds of thousands of more this holiday season will be grieving the loss of a father, a mother, a grandparent, a teacher, a friend, and even a son or a daughter. This generation is now entering the job market under circumstances far worse than even after the 2008 crisis. The first class of Gen Z graduated from college in May of 2019 and unceremoniously lost their jobs or had their work situation dramatically change with the onset of the pandemic. By the end of May, more than 7.7 million workers younger than 30 were unemployed in the US. Nearly 1 in 3 young workers are now jobless, the highest rate since the country has started recording joblessness by age in 1948. Many are waiting in food lines. Others are living day to day with the threat of eviction hanging over their heads. They're delaying life milestones such as marriage and children. And they're witnessing in real time the breakdown of American democracy as the President of the United States threatens to remain in office even if he loses the election. Under such conditions, it's no surprise that this election is seeing an upsurge in turnout among the youth. However, I think it would be a mistake to see this turnout as simply support for Biden. Rather, it's another indication of the deep-seated hatred for the Trump administration that's felt so widely among young people. It's clear that young people want to fight. And this emerging generation of workers is not only looking to fight against Trump, but they're looking for a way to fight for democratic rights, for workers' rights, for healthcare, for open borders, and for socialism. They're deeply concerned with the state of the world. They're motivated over issues of climate change, opposition to war, the defense of democratic rights, the defense of immigrants. One does not have to look very far to see how these objective changes colliding with the events of the last year have vastly impacted the youth politically. One statistic that just begins to demonstrate this radicalization, this year's annual survey conducted by YouGov found an increase in support for socialism over the last year among youth that are part of the Gen Z generation, so that's ages 16 to about 23, by nearly 10 percentage points. So over the course of a single year, we've seen support for socialism among these young people rising from 40% in 2019 to 49% in 2020. This statistic reflects massive shifts in consciousness. The radicalization of this generation has already taken notable forms. Just 2 years ago in 2018, we witnessed over 1 million young people marching in the March for Our Lives protest to oppose mass violence in their schools and in society more broadly. In 2019, youth and workers crashed the Selective Service website after Trump's illegal drone murder of the Iranian general Soleimani. Millions of people took to social media to express their opposition to the growing threat of a third world war. Just this year, the protests that emerged against police violence after the killing of George Floyd were largely predominated by the youth in every major city across the country, and in fact, in cities across the world. There is no lack of willingness to fight. Young people have a deep desire to change the world, to sweep aside all of the violence and human degradation that's brought on by the capitalist system. Politically, however, there is no outlet outside of our movement for youth. The ruling class is well aware of the mass disillusionment among young people with the Democratic Party. They know that the masses of society are moving to the left. It is for this reason that they've put forward their own quote unquote left candidates, such as Bernie Sanders. Millions of young people supported Bernie Sanders, and they were motivated by genuine sentiments. They're attracted to his left rhetoric, his attack on the billionaire class, his occasional, and less so as his campaign went on, identification as a socialist. In a word, his class appeal. However, now having been through an enormous experience in the second campaign of Bernie Sanders, the necessary lessons must be drawn. Sanders' political trajectory throughout the pandemic has been a sharp lesson in Democratic Party politics. Sanders' aim, as the WSW has said since the beginning of his first presidential bid in 2016, is not to create a revolution, as he asserts in his campaign speeches, but to prevent one. It is worth asking, what has been the outcome of his so-called political revolution? Sanders' campaign has given way to ever further shifts to the right, abandoning even the pretense of fighting for mild liberal reforms. After announcing that he was dropping out of the presidential race just at the point when the coronavirus cases in the US were reaching their first peak, hospitals were being overwhelmed, he endorsed Joe Biden. And told all of his supporters to give it their all for his good friend Joe. His capitulation to Biden was followed by an interview with the Associated Press, in which he slandered as irresponsible any of his supporters who failed to campaign for Biden. In response to massive multiracial, multi-ethnic protests against police brutality across the US and around the world, Sanders was silent. When he did finally address the situation, he called for the police officers to get a raise. He mustered only a few mildly worded tweets regarding Trump's attempt in June to carry out a coup that would involve the mobilization of active duty troops to put down the protests and establish a presidential dictatorship. Now, as class antagonisms are reaching a fever pitch, Sanders is doing everything in his power to obscure the class character of society, campaigning alongside Kamala Harris to get out the vote for Biden. The fact of the matter is that the ruling class has something of a division of labor. Sanders plays a particular function, providing a left cover for a right-wing capitalist party. Every advanced country has its own variety of Sanders. In Great Britain, there's Corbynism. In Greece, there's the experience of Syriza. In Spain, Podemos. They're all used to prevent social opposition from finding a genuine progressive outlet. These figures create the conditions for a further shift to the right, along with the disorientation of broad masses of people. Sanders played a critical role in 2016 in creating the conditions for Trump's victory by directing all opposition behind Clinton. To the extent that the working class remains trapped in the Democratic Party and does not advance its own solution to the crisis with its own program, the most right-wing forces will exploit the situation, no matter who is in the White House. Every effort has been made and will be made to divert opposition back into the safe confines of the two-party system. Young people, workers must be warned that there will be more Sanders and more AOCs, individuals and organizations that are used to convince workers and youth that despite the 200 years of experience with this party, that they should give the Democrats just one more shot. The justification being used to browbeat youth into staying trapped within the Democratic Party is being conducted on the lowest possible level. There's Sanders, who slanders his supporters as irresponsible. There's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who just made the cover of Vogue magazine, insisting that youth must be pragmatic. And then there's the slogan that one hears ad nauseum on social media to, quote unquote, settle for Biden. Youth should really stop and consider concretely what they're being asked to settle for exactly. To settle for Biden is to settle for the party that institutionalized drone assassinations, including US citizens, the party that jailed and tortured Chelsea Manning and persecuted Julian Assange, the party which oversaw the bloodletting in Afghanistan and Iraq, the bombing of Libya, the 6-year-long war for regime change in Syria, and the support for the Saudi-led destruction of Yemen. Or if one wants to go back further, this is the party responsible for the exclusion of the Japanese and Chinese immigrants, for Jim Crow segregation, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the launching of the Korean War and the Vietnam War. This is what it means to settle for the Democratic Party. It is a completely legitimate and healthy sentiment that so many young people want to oppose Trump. However, one must understand the root of the matter. Out of what does Trump arise? This is not a fight primarily against one individual. Of course not. It's a fight against an entire system, capitalism. Furthermore, one's politics can't only be about what you're fighting against, but also what you're fighting for. It is necessary now to assimilate the experience of the Sanders campaign to draw the appropriate political conclusions. Youth must reject all types of pragmatic politics that hopes for a solution to the crisis confronting the working class without a direct challenge to the capitalist system. What workers and young people need above all is their own politics, working class socialist politics, not the political revolution to promote the Democratic Party as put forward by figures like Sanders, but a socialist revolution to overthrow capitalism. The Socialist Equality Party is fighting for social equality. That is, for the vast sums of wealth monopolized by the rich through the exploitation and immiseration of the working class to be seized and directed towards the satisfaction of social needs. We're fighting for internationalism, based on the principle that workers in every country have the same social interests and the same class enemies. We're fighting for the defense of democratic rights, for the defense of art and culture, science and education, for the right to leisure. We're proposing not mild reforms that the ruling class will not tolerate, but revolution, the overthrow of capitalist property relations through the establishment of democratic control over the giant banks and corporations. We're fighting for the political mobilization of the working class in opposition to the Democratic and Republican parties to take power and establish a workers' government to reorganize economic life in the United States and internationally on the basis of social need and not private profit. The purpose of the Socialist Equality Party presidential campaign, as the other speakers have noted, was always conceived of as a way to bring our program and international perspective to the widest possible audience, both in the United States and throughout the world. No matter what the outcome of the election on Tuesday, none of the fundamental problems facing workers will be resolved. And there is so much at stake. We call on workers and young people to not settle, but to join our party and to fight for a better world, to fight for principles, to take up the fight for socialism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Genevieve. Now we will return to Comrade Tom. Hopefully this time we won't have any problems with the transmission, but Comrade Tom will conclude his remarks. Tom.
Thank you, Dave. I'll pick up from where I believe I cut out. Schools and workplaces have served as centers for the spread of the disease into broader communities. Nearly 200,000 healthcare workers in the United States alone have been infected, and at least 750 nurses, doctors, and other frontline healthcare workers are dead. At least 48,000 infections and 200 deaths have occurred in meatpacking plants, which have also served as transmission vectors for the virus into rural areas of the country. More than 100,000 students and educational workers in K-12 schools are infected, including at least 5,000 in the state of Michigan alone. There are no reliable figures on the extent of the virus in the auto plants, owing to a cover-up by the companies with the support of the United Auto Workers Union. But the virus is now spreading rapidly in the Midwest, where the auto industry is concentrated. All rational and scientifically guided approaches to fight the pandemic have faltered against the selfish profit interests of the bourgeoisie, the tiny minority which owns society. Only through the independent intervention of the working class against the bourgeoisie's policy of herd immunity, that is, the deliberate infection of the population, can hundreds of thousands of lives be saved. And time and again, it is the international working class which has emerged as the basic force in society fighting for a rational, scientifically grounded approach to halt the spread of the virus. In March, as the pandemic was beginning to circle the world, a global wildcat strike wave in the auto industry spread outwards from Italy into Spain and across the Atlantic into North America, forcing the ruling class to carry out lockdown measures. The World Socialist Web Site played a significant role in encouraging opposition among workers. A statement of the Socialist Equality Party, which was published on the WSWS, shut down the auto industry to halt the spread of coronavirus, was read hundreds of thousands of times in the week before the first strikes broke out in Michigan and Ohio. When the lockdowns were lifted at the end of the spring and workers were forced back into the factories, more wildcat strikes broke out at 2 Fiat Chrysler plants in Detroit. They were joined in July by walkouts among meatpacking workers, most importantly at the JBS beef plant in Greeley, Colorado. Healthcare workers, outraged by the lack of resources allocated to fight the disease, and in some cases reduced to wearing trash bags instead of proper PPE, have carried out strikes and protests throughout the country. Over the summer, and especially after the reopening of schools, teachers have also emerged as a center of opposition. Even before schools reopened in August, teachers and students held at least 330 demonstrations in 42 states against reopening. Sickouts and protests demand proper cleaning and social distancing, which is particularly vital in public schools where 30 or more students are regularly herded into a single classroom, have continued throughout the school year. Auto workers, teachers, transit workers, and other sections of the working class have also taken up the call by the World Socialist Web Site and the Socialist Equality Party to establish rank and file safety committees, independent of the unions, to fight the pandemic, expose the cover-up of outbreaks, and enforce health and safety protocols. They have done this because the unions come down on the side of the companies and the government against the workers. Having long been completely integrated into management, they are now playing a leading role in keeping workers on the job, even as the virus continues to spread throughout the workplace. Because of this, the fight by workers for safe conditions has brought them into open conflict with the unions which falsely claim to represent them. The ruling class, meanwhile, is pursuing a policy of herd immunity designed to sacrifice workers' lives to bolster corporate profits. The ruling class sees workers as expendable, exemplified by Donald Trump's claim that the US is rounding the final turn in the pandemic, and his son Donald Trump Jr.'s claim that the number of deaths per day is, quote, almost nothing. Now, I want to cite a few figures which shed further light on this. This past week, the United States surpassed 100,000 new infections per day for the first time, and I believe the first time anywhere that that's happened in the world, as the pandemic spirals completely out of control. More than 800 Americans on average die every day of the disease, and that figure will no doubt rise rapidly over the coming months. But this very same week, Ford and Fiat Chrysler announced they had made massive profits in the third quarter. Ford made $2.4 billion in profits, up significantly from $425 million in the third quarter of last year, and Fiat Chrysler made $1.4 billion in the quarter. This same period of time, from July 1st to September 30th, saw a massive resurgence of coronavirus in the United States, which has killed over 80,000 people and infected over 4.5 million. The number of infections is 70% more over that 3-month span than the infections which had occurred in the entire first half of the year. And yet the North American auto industry produced essentially the same number of cars in the third quarter of 2020 as they did at the same time last year. Such figures are only possible through a systematic cover-up of the spread of the virus in the plants and through brutal speed-up and forced overtime. And now many auto workers have learned through the World Socialist Web Site that skilled trades at Sterling Heights Assembly Plant are being forced to work 12-hour shifts for 7 days a week. This shows that herd immunity is not just the policy of Trump, but the entire American ruling class. This policy cannot be enforced through democratic means. It must be recalled that some of the future co-conspirators in the plot to kidnap and murder Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer first met at the armed right-wing demonstrations against the lockdown measures in April in Lansing, Michigan, the state capital, which were backed financially by powerful elements within the Republican Party. But the Democrats, no less than Trump and the Republicans, have worked to end lockdown and social distancing measures to bolster corporate profits. Whitmer herself was instrumental in reopening the auto industry. Moreover, while Trump is conspiring with fascists and elements within the state to overturn the election, the Democrats have also repudiated the right to vote one's conscience by keeping the SEP off the ballot in Michigan and California, and Democratic mayors have not hesitated to unleash brutal crackdowns against protests against police violence. The response of both parties to the pandemic and to Trump's threats to repudiate the election follow a definite class logic. The Democrats, as Comrade Eric explained so forcefully, are far more terrified of mass opposition in the working class than they are even of the threat of dictatorship in the United States. They seek to oppose Trump's methods of the putsch through the methods of the palace coup, attempting to appeal to sections of the military and the state apparatus and working to keep the scale of the danger out of view of public eyes. We propose an entirely different solution. We say that the only means to defend democracy is through the mobilization of the working class against the source of dictatorship, the capitalist system. We are for genuine democracy, not simply the right to vote every 4 years between one of two representatives of Wall Street. Democracy cannot be reconciled with a social system where a tiny minority owns everything and is prepared to sacrifice the lives of millions to increase and safeguard its wealth. Real democracy, including workplace democracy, occurs when the working class, the vast majority of society, has control not only over its own conditions of life, but over the direction of society as a whole. This is the program of socialism. To those workers who are listening today who agree with this, history is confronting you with a choice. There is no progressive solution to the crisis outside of the struggle for socialism within the working class. Therefore, you must get off the sidelines and join the Socialist Equality Party and become political leaders in the working class. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Tom. That brings us to the conclusion of this rally. I don't have that much to add because so many of the speakers have spoken with great clarity and with great depth about the crisis that is posed in this election, and have presented, I believe, very forcefully the program of the Socialist Equality Party and the program of the Fourth International. But I would like to make a few observations. Taken as a whole, I am convinced and I am sure that the level of analysis that you have heard this afternoon is so far beyond anything else that has been presented by any other party during the course of the past year that no comparison can even be made. Of course, Trump, one hears excuse the insult to the animals, but just to use a metaphor, the bark of the dog and the grunt of the pig, though I believe they would be somewhat embarrassed by the level of his comments and remarks. But yesterday, Barack Obama was in Detroit with Biden, and it was appalling to listen to their hokey-jokey style, devoid of substance, devoid of analysis, exuding a form of contempt for the working class, acting as if workers were incapable of understanding anything except when addressed with the crudest of phrases, the most banal remarks. Nothing was presented seriously. Nothing was said that was memorable. After all, they spoke in a state where there is an ongoing conspiracy which threatened the life of a governor who just happens to be a member of their own party. And yet they said nothing about it. So when you are told that you must support Biden because that is the only alternative to the danger of Trump, that is equivalent of saying there is no alternative at all. Because if they won't even defend their own party, the representatives of their own political organization, how can they be expected to defend the broad mass of the population? And if they win this election, you can be certain that the very arguments that were made to convince everyone that they should be supported now will be used to say that you must support them in the future. After all, nothing must be done to undermine the Biden administration, because as bad as he is, what would come next would be even worse. That is, they would justify, as the saying goes, the swinishness of today by invoking the swinishness of yesterday. Having brought him into power, you must keep him there no matter what. There must be a complete break with this sort of pragmatic politics. Among the most important elements that distinguish a Marxist, a genuine revolutionary party, from the bits and pieces of pragmatic politics that characterize all the opportunist organizations, is that our party learns from history. We are a party of history. Our political program is not based on impressions of what has just happened today or yesterday or the day before. We infuse our analysis with the whole strategic experience of the class struggle, not only in the United States, but internationally. When the danger of fascism is invoked, we work off of the experience of the 1930s, of the betrayals that made possible the victory of Hitler and all the catastrophes that followed. The causes of the defeat of the working class in Spain and the great revolutionary movement between 1936 and 1937, how that movement was betrayed. We invoke and understand the conditions which led to the creation of a dictatorship in Chile in 1973 or in Argentina in 1976, or even more recently, the imposition of a military dictatorship in Egypt, supported by Barack Obama in 2011. We learn from history. It's not a blank sheet for us. And it's necessary for workers to draw upon these lessons. The great revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg once said, history is the most powerful weapon of the working class. All its great struggles, with its many victims, the experiences of defeat, but also a victory. All of this is part of the great heritage of a genuine working class movement. Our political opponents call us sectarian. But what they refer to as sectarianism is a commitment to principle. We do not make compromises for the sake of short-term and really ephemeral gains. We have, I think, a very realistic sense of what is to come. We don't view Trump as a buffoon, nor do we view him as a demon from the depths. He is a voice of the ruthless, which articulates the ruthlessness and brutality and backwardness and corruption of American capitalism. He came to prominence, as I said before, with the financing of countless banks. The media made him a personality. And now, those who helped him all the way along say he's the worst thing that ever happened and the only alternative is Biden. We advance an independent political line. We are serious about fighting Trump and all that he represents. But that fight requires the mobilization of the working class. Great historical changes can only be achieved through the intervention of the masses of working people into political life. Now, we use terms such as political independence of the working class. We're speaking of a situation where workers and young people, conscious of their objective social interests, begin acting upon those interests. When they think critically about political questions, where they take questions of programs seriously, when they reach a level of political understanding that enables them to see through the fraudulent phrases of the charlatans, of the media, when they understand that their objective interests lie in the unity of the working class of all ethnicities, racial backgrounds, national origins, when they understand in the United States that they are part of an international class, and that this class, when united, has the power to change the world. And so this is why we're asking you to draw the lessons now of this election year, of the critical experiences that have made 2020 one of the central years in modern history, a year of extraordinary transition. As one of the, I think it was Comrade Joe correctly recalled, at the beginning of 2020, we said the 2020s would be the decade of social revolution. I think perhaps even our most loyal and committed readers and supporters might have thought there was an element of exaggeration or, in fact, unwarranted optimism. But who can doubt that we've reached some sort of fundamental turning point in history. That the issue can go one or two ways. It can go toward a tragic culmination, fascism and war, or to social revolution. We believe objective conditions favor the latter. We live in a world that has been globalized. The experiences of the workers in every country occur almost simultaneously. If there is one unique feature of the pandemic, it is an experience through which literally billions of people are going through. An American worker, a Brazilian worker, a worker in the Middle East, in any part of Europe or in Africa. The word pandemic, COVID-19, that is an international phrase, and everywhere the same issue arises. If there is going to be a fight to save lives, it is the working class that must come forward. It must impose upon this crisis its own solution. So that's been the point of our election campaign. Our work doesn't end on Tuesday. It will continue. As I said before, we don't have a policy for the elections as if it's distinct from our other work. It's one aspect, and it's a means by which we apply a broader strategy to a specific political task. But our program remains the same. We are fighting to build an international socialist movement. We are fighting to infuse the American working class with a historical understanding of its task. We're fighting to build a party with our comrades all over the world that can change the course of history. And if that's what you want to do, if you agree with us, then join our party. Take out an application. Let us know that you want to be contacted, become part of this movement, and help us build a party which will achieve the future and safeguard the future of mankind. Thank you very much. I hope that you've enjoyed and learned from this rally.